Even in our first unit, we were talking about economic and social differences between North and South. That is only going to continue in what we call the antebellum period, the period before the Civil War. Now, in the South, their geography determines a lot of what happens. I think we tend to imagine the South as being full of plantations, but there's quite a range of ecosystems. We have very swampy lands, there's great farmland, there's very dry land. What was most common throughout the South at this time were small farmers. It really was not the norm in the South to have a huge plantation. Only one third of all white Southern males even owned a slave. Most, if anyone did have a slave, they probably owned, three or four, maybe 10 at most. And it wouldn't have been uncommon for these white farmers to work side by side with their slaves. With the plantations, however, this really does fall into sort of this quintessential idea of pre-Civil War South. A plantation was usually considered to have 100 or more slaves. And throughout all of the South, there are probably fewer than 2,000 of these plantations of this size. Now, we can't forget the role of women on these plantations. I think we have this vision of the Southern Belle, as you see on the screen there, but the plantation owner's wife played a really important role. Not only did she have to ensure that she was continuing her husband's line by giving birth to boys, but she had to sort of educate those boys, and in many ways was responsible for the running of the entire household, for the health of the slaves, for the health of everyone involved. It really is a matter of protecting the investment of the whole plantation. So the women in the South, compared to their northern counterparts, married younger, had children earlier, and died younger as well, and worked probably much harder on a day to day basis. For conditions on these plantations, the the slave owners would have made sure that there was adequate food, not a variety of food, but adequate calorie intake. Would have made sure that there have been shelters for their slaves. Now, this is really, again, they're protecting their investment. They want to make sure that these slaves are healthy enough to work and healthy enough to procreate to create another generation of slaves. We see these horrific images of slaves being mistreated, which is absolutely true, but there were also cases of slaves who had sort of a peaceful understanding or a peaceful relationship with their owners. Now, regardless, it is never okay to own another human being. And that's one thing when looking back at history, I think some people tend to say, well, it has been blown out of proportion or the violence has been exaggerated, but you can never exaggerate the the inhumanity of owning another human. On these plantations, though, there are sort of different rules about how slaves can behave. The slaves who work in the home, the house slaves, they were considered superior to the field slaves. They don't mix with each other. And this is in turn reinforced by laws, which we now call slave codes. These slave codes throughout the South, um, they were passed at a state level, but there were a lot of common trends in these slave codes. So slaves couldn't do business with one another if it was in their own plantation, whether it's with another plantation. Any business or any transactions must first be okayed by both of the owners. Um, Regardless of if you're a house slave or a field slave, you could be transferred as property, and because of this, they did not encourage marriages. Now, they did encourage procreation, but not marriages or traditional family units. So that's why slave marriages were not legally binding. They weren't allowed to have a legal ceremony. So it became very common to have an informal ceremony, and they developed the jumping over the broom, and that was a symbol for many in these slave communities of their commitment to each other. The slave codes, however, would not allow those legal marriages. Another part of the slave codes is they wouldn't let any slave have possession of a gun. So all of this is really to protect these whites. They are afraid of uprisings. They are afraid of allowing them to assemble and create a situation like we saw in Haiti in the early 1800s, where the slaves rose up against the white owners. Now, while this is such an important part of Southern culture in the 1800s, there still are plenty of yeoman farmers. The Jeffersonian ideal of an individual landowner farmer working his own land. In the North, it is all about industry, not agriculture. So this is the time of the Industrial Revolution, which you learned about in European history, where we are taking individual producers and we are now mechanizing the system, putting it all under one roof into a factory. Just like in England, the northern United States will focus on textiles, specifically cotton. So the North relies on the South in order to make these fabrics. People who work in the factories, usually young women, farm girls, they do not need to be skilled laborers, and they aren't going to need to be trained for any amount of time because they're going to get married in just a few short years. One major thing that is going to create a bigger boom in the Industrial Revolution in America is interchangeable parts. For most things that were produced, like a gun, for instance, guns would be made on one by one by a gunsmith. Boop. Eli Whitney, who created the cotton gin, also starts creating interchangeable parts for guns. President Thomas Jefferson had seen something very similar when he was Secretary of State in France, and Eli Whitney is the one to make it happen. He has a contract with the government, and the purpose of this is to create guns where it could be one part for any gun, rather than a purely individualized gun. So we are mechanizing the process of everything possible in order to work faster and more effectively and cheaper. As these factories get bigger and bigger and bigger, many factory owners decide to create housing for their workers so they can get to work quickly. So we start to see factory towns, entire communities based completely on this economic output. That isn't to say that urban centers start diminishing. It's just that we start to see an urban spread. We start to see new places that are being established purely for industry. With these economic possibilities, America becomes incredibly enticing for other people, especially from Northern Europe. And in class, we talked about the issue of push or pull. Is the pull of possibility what's bringing people to the United States, or is it the push of situations in Europe? And we said, it's a bit of both. That there are so many new jobs that are replacing old jobs. There's a big population boom in Europe, especially in Ireland. We have the potato blight, the Industrial Revolution, political, religious issues. So these are the push factors, but the pull is America has all of this land. That land can be used for farming. It also is having an industrial revolution, but on a bigger scale, so there are more jobs, and it has a reputation for freedom. The two biggest groups that come to the United States in the mid-1800s are the Irish and the Germans. Now, they don't share many similarities, other than in these pictures liking large beer steins, but in general, we have an issue of unskilled workers versus skilled workers. Germans tended to be skilled laborers, meaning carpenters, smiths, masons. They are skilled in a trade. While the Irish were farmers. And so for these immigrants who are coming to America, especially the Irish, they are not trained in any particular one skill, so they are going to end up usually in these unskilled factory jobs. Germans who are more skilled in trades will be able to find other jobs. This will also play into where they settle. Now, they will both generally tend to settle with people from their original community or their original nationality. Germans will tend to go further inland because the German community had been established in America even pre-Revolutionary War. And then we have situations like the Hessians, the Germans who were fighting for the British. Many of them stayed and settled and became American citizens. Many of the Irish communities will be in the cities along the East Coast. But that's because, again, the Irish are coming. They don't have a community already established, so they end up staying, working unskilled jobs in factories in the cities. Just as we saw in Europe, we will see in America a new middle class. So now that we have all of these new immigrants to do the low class jobs, we have the owners who are making lots and lots of money, then we have the middle class, the people who are the managers for these companies, people who are doing new jobs that never existed before, shop owners, as you see here, real estate agents. So we are replicating and doing at the same time what's going on with Europe in the Industrial Revolution.